In this video, we will show you how to replace your power steering rack assembly on the Chevy Trailblazer. This is part of your front steering, located behind your front wheels. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to mention is you want to make sure you're in a safe area that you can raise and support the front of the vehicle. Once you've done so, you want to make sure that you flush out the power steering system with the manufacturer's specified fluid. You never want to continue with this process with dirty old fluid. The power steering reservoir is located right along the passenger side of the engine. Now, since we will have to remove the steering shaft from the steering rack, you want to make sure you tie off that steering wheel so it can't spin on you. That will cause damage to your clock spring. The next thing we'll do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so both front wheels are off the ground. We're going to have to remove each of the front wheels and the outer tie rod ends. To remove the front wheels, start by removing the center cover. You can use a plastic trim tool. Remove your 6 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now we can start separating the outer tie rod end from the inner tie rod ends. To do this, we'll use an 1/16" in this area and a 24mm or 1" wrench on this jam nut. We'll have to turn this counterclockwise to break it free. Now once you have some movement from the jam nut, we'll continue following that outer tie rod end to where it connects onto the steering knuckle. We'll use some cutters for this. It is a good idea to replace these. Generally, they get pretty mangled. We'll use a 21mm for that tie rod nut. Leave it on there just a couple threads. Now we'll separate the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. When doing so, you want to be extremely careful not to damage the joint of the tie rod or the protective boot. Generally, by leaving the nut on here just a couple threads, we'll continue with a hammer. Give this a couple taps, it should want to break free. Now that we have that broken free, let's continue on by turning this counterclockwise to remove it from the inner tie rod end. When doing so, we want to count the amount of turns, so when we're putting everything back together, we can install it in the same place. 1, 2, and so on. On my application, I got 21 turns. Yours may differ. All right, now let's go over and do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Once you have the other side tie rod out of place, we'll continue on to removing the brackets, which would be located underneath that tie rod end area. You'll find that you have 3 15mm headed bolts and 2 21mm headed bolts for each one of these brackets. The forward 15mm headed bolt is considerably longer than the other two. Now we can remove our 2 21mm headed bolts. Now let's go ahead and remove this center shield. This will be held in place with 4 13mm headed bolts, one along each corner. One of ours is already missing. We'll inspect that mounting hardware as we continue removing it. Hold that plate when you remove your final bolt. We'll set this aside. Now let's make our way along the back side of this cross member. In this area, you're going to find that you have several 15mm headed bolts. There's only one on each side that we will be dealing with. That's this center one right here. Now keep in mind, as you remove these, it's the only thing holding this center piece up. So you want to be extremely careful as you remove the final bolt. Once we have the first one out, we'll start it in just a couple threads and remove the final bolt. Let's get this one. side's broken free. Let's pull it out of here. Remove this from the vehicle. With that out of the way, let's pay attention up inside of this area. Now you can see your power steering line right up along this, but we're going to pause on the lines and we'll make our way to disconnecting the steering shaft from the power steering rack. Right up behind this boot, approximately where my pry bar is located, is where that mounting bolt will be located. We're going to carefully start lifting this boot up and out of our way without tearing it or damaging it in any way, because this protects the power steering rack. You can use a pry bar, your hands, whatever works best for you. We just want to try to work it around, maybe even multiple bars if you need to. Start pressing it up. You can see the head of that pinch bolt there. We'll just go ahead and remove that pinch bolt. Now with that boot lifted up, we have a clear view of the pinch bolt. Before we start removing that, I need to reiterate, you have to have your steering wheel tied off so there's no way the steering wheel can spin once we have this broken free. That will cause damage to your airbag system. We'll use a 15mm to remove this bolt. Typically, it is a good idea to replace these pinch bolts. If you're not, you need to give it a close inspection, clean the threads, and apply some blue thread locker. Now at this point, we'll start lifting the steering shaft up and off of the power steering rack. That up and off of there, quick inspection. We can set that aside. Now that we have that out of the way, let's pay attention to our power steering lines. There are two areas on this power steering rack that have lines. Looking along the back side, you'll find that you have some that go into the back of the rack, but those are actually part of the power steering rack, so we're not going to remove those. Look up along the front, right along this area. We'll continue on by cleaning up the area and then removing the bracket and the lines from the power steering rack. We'll have a collection bucket under here so we can recycle the fluid properly. We'll use a 1/4 inch 8mm with a medium size extension here. Make our way right inside there. We can remove that mounting bolt. Just use a magnet. Now we can remove the lines from the power steering rack. If you have a hard time reaching in there, you can also try using a pry bar. You just want to essentially pull these right out of place. Sometimes a little wiggle will do. Once the lines have drained as much as possible, we'll continue on to removing the two 21mm bolts that hold the power steering rack to the frame of the vehicle. You'll have one on each side. These are the last things holding this power steering rack in. We'll remove the first one, quick inspection of the bolt, start it in a couple threads, and fully remove the second bolt. Now on the far side of these bolts, on the other side of the frame, you're going to find that you also have a 21mm nut. To gain access to that nut, you're going to have to turn the axle just enough that you can make your way in with a 21mm socket and a breaker bar. While holding the nut in place, we'll continue on to removing the bolt from the rearward side. There's the nut from the other side there. We'll set that aside. The same on the other side here. We'll hold that nut. Take hold of the power steering rack. We'll lift that up and down as needed and fully remove that mounting bolt. At this point, we can maneuver the rack around. We'll be holding on to it while we remove that final bolt and then pull it down and out of place. Be extremely careful here. There it is, friend. With the power steering rack out of place, the next thing we want to do is clean and inspect the lines that go into it. We are not going to use any parts cleaner on this because we don't want anything making its way into the power steering system. Double check to make sure there's no debris anywhere in this area, and then we can continue. Now we can prepare the brand new power steering rack for installation. To prepare this, we need to center the power steering rack. To do this, we'll use some locking pliers. Being extremely careful not to damage the shaft of the power steering rack, we'll just lightly grip onto this. Now the next thing we need to do is ensure that the shaft itself is properly aligned with the original here. The pinch bolt for the original came along the front side here, so we want the pinch bolt on the new one to align in the same area. While doing that, we also want to pay attention to each side where those tie rod ends would go. We want that to be centered, not all the way to one side or the other. Let's just go ahead and start turning this. As you do it slowly. There is a possibility that fluid may come out of this area. I've got my pinch bolt coming straight across the front here, just like on the original. Now we'll just do a quick measurement of each side here. These feel exactly the same, and we can get this in the vehicle. All right, let's get ready to install that brand new power steering rack. We'll take this and slowly put it in place, being careful not to damage any lines or anything on the power steering rack in general. Let's get this one in here as well. All right, so now that they're both started, we'll start on the mounting nuts for each of these. Once you have them both started on, we can continue on to tightening these and then torquing them to 81 foot-pounds. While we're over here, we'll torque this to 81 foot-pounds, make our way over to the other side and do the exact same thing. Now that we have the rack bolts in, let's continue on to the intermediate steering shaft. This part's going to be a little bit difficult because we have to lift up on the boot, pull the shaft down over the shaft on the rack itself, and put in that one pinch bolt. Let's lift this up and have a quick look under there. Good news is it looks like it's pretty much already lined up for us. Yours may differ. We're just going to hold this up, try to carefully make our way in here and get this aligned. Once you have the intermediate shaft slid onto the power steering rack, we're going to continue on with our pinch bolt. Once again, we want to make sure we're using a little bit of blue thread locker on this just to make sure it's held in place. We'll start this in, bottom it out, and then torque it to 29 foot-pounds. Let's slide the protective boot back into its original position. Once you've removed the plastic covers along the front ports of the power steering rack, now we can put in our seals. Now for these, you just want to carefully take hold of them and we'll slide them directly into each port of the rack. Press that in as far as you can. We'll double check that and do the same to the other. We'll continue on by sliding those lines into place. Put in your 1 8mm headed mounting bolt, snug it up, and torque it to 109 inch-pounds. Get the torque wrench on there. There's 109 inch-pounds right there. Now we can put in our cross member. Let's get this aligned. Start in all of the mounting bolts before you tighten any of them. Now we can start putting in these smaller bolts. We have our one bolt that goes up along the top on each side as well. Now that we have all of the mounting bolts started, snug them up. We'll start with the 4 21mm headed mounting bolts, 2 on each side, bottom them out, and torque each of those to 177 foot-pounds. Now we can move along to each of our 15mm headed bolts. You'll have 4 of these on each side of the vehicle. 3 down along the bottom and 1 tucked up along the rear. Torque these to 37 foot-pounds. Let's put on our lower shield. Once again, there should be 4 bolts for this holding it in place. Ours was missing 1. Should be 1 there. Now it's going to be time to reinstall both of our outer tie rod ends. When doing so, it's a good idea to use some copper anti-seize directly inside of the inner tie rod end, which is attached to the power steering rack, just on the threaded area. Install the outer tie rod end. This should go in the same amount of turns as it took to remove it originally. For us, it was 21 full turns. Just pivot this. 1, 2, and so on. Start the nut on, snug it up, and torque it to 44 foot-pounds. Now the next thing you need to do is pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the hole that goes through the stud of the tie rod end. If for some reason the slot is not aligned with the hole in the tie rod end, continue tightening the nut until the very next slot is. After that, put in your locking cotter pin. We can slide this through. There we are. Just pin this over. Make your way to the jam nut. You want to bottom the jam nut out against the inner tie rod end, so we'll take those 2 wrenches and snug them up together. Once you're sure everything's tight and torqued on this side, do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Now once you've completed that, we'll install both of the front wheels. Start on the lug nuts, bottom them out, and get the wheels safely back on the ground. With both wheels on, we'll continue on with torquing these in a crisscross manner to 100 foot-pounds. Now that we have that torqued, we'll continue on with our center cover. Looking at the center cover, you'll find that you have a small picture of a valve stem. So we'll take this and we'll put it in place. Put the valve stem right down there. Obviously the same on both sides of the vehicle. Let's make our way inside the passenger compartment here. We'll get this off of here. Let's get under the hood. Now we can start filling the power steering system. There's a couple things we want to pay attention to. First of all, it's a good idea to have both front wheels up and off the ground just a tiny bit. Now once we've done that, we're going to start adding the manufacturer's specified fluid directly into the reservoir. If you were to look at the power steering cap, you'll find that you have a small dipstick that is attached to the cap. Down along the bottom, there's a small line that says add. Moving up, you have a line with a C for cold, and then a line with an H for hot. These are the levels that we want to be at when the power steering fluid is full. If it's cold, you want to be at that cold level. If it's hot, it's going to come up a little bit because fluid expands, and it should be in the hot level here. It's okay if the fluid's a little high at this point because we do have to burp out any air in the system. get the key in the on position here. Now we'll start turning the wheel slowly all the way to one side. Once we're at that point, we'll pause and then continue all the way over to the other side. This isn't a race. All we're trying to do is burp out any air in the system and allow fluid to make its way down and through. We'll just make sure we're checking on that fluid as we continue, top it off as necessary. Let's repeat this process as many times as it takes to remove as much air as possible. Because if you were to start up the vehicle with any air in the system, it's going to create a whole bunch of air bubbles and cause an issue. Now that we've gone side to side several times, we'll just check that fluid level before we start it up. As you can tell, the dipstick is showing that we are very low. So we'll just add up to the cold line, start up the vehicle, let it run, check for leaks. Oh yeah, that looks good. Let's start it up. While this is running, we'll just continue turning the wheel side to side. I'm listening to hear if I can hear any type of odd howling noise coming from the power steering pump while I do so. That would mean that there's air in the system. This sounds perfect. Now that we've run the vehicle and we're sure that we have no more air in the system, we'll make sure that we have the vehicle back down on a flat level surface so we can confirm the level of the fluid. Just pull that out. As you can tell, I'm right up to the C range here for cold, which is exactly where I need to be. The engine hasn't exactly warmed up all the way yet. We'll clean this off, reinstall it. Okay friends, we fully installed our power steering rack in the vehicle. We bled out all the air in the system. At this point, clean your mess, make sure you don't have any leaks, and take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.